Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Bill 21 in Quebec, which is their religious symbols law, and a recent decision from the Quebec Court of Appeal related to that law. Now, Derek, Guillaume, both of you were involved in the case in some way. Christian Legal Fellowship, Derek, was an intervener in the case, and Guillaume, you were counsel for an intervener. So I'd be interested in hearing the positions that both of you or your organizations took in the case. Let's start with you, Guillaume.
Yeah, so my client, the Mouvement Laïque Québécois, is part of the trial to support the position of the Attorney General of Quebec and therefore to support Bill 21. And we have some argument that are a little different from the argument of the AG. I can maybe explain it to you later. But also, what's very important is that we add witnesses. So we had parents, and most of them Muslim, by the way, who came in front of the judge and said that they support the bill, that they want their children to go to public secular school, and they don't want their children to be under religious pressures.
Which is actually a sort of feature of interventions in Quebec that is not common or not possible in other parts of Canada. Typically, an intervener would not be able to lead new evidence, but in Quebec, there is a possibility of doing that. So that's an interesting procedural quirk for our lawyers who are watching. Derek, what about you? What did Christian Legal Fellowship argue as an intervener?
So, CLF, as an association of religious lawyers, is deeply concerned about any rule that would effectively exclude individuals from working within parts of the legal profession based on their openly religious identity. CLF specifically raised concerns about the impact of this law on religious freedom and religious equality, both of which are protected in the Charter of Quebec and in the Canadian Charter. As we might talk about, though, those protections, their operations are suspended because the government invoked the notwithstanding clause. But we raise the argument that there are other protections for religious freedom and for the right of all religious citizens to equally access public institutions that exist outside of the charter. And one of the questions that we asked the court to address was, what is the nature of those constitutional protections? The charter was introduced in 1982, but it did not introduce religious freedom to Canada for the first time. Unfortunately, though, pre-charter case law didn't necessarily resolve unequivocally the state of religious freedom in Canada. So there are certain questions that the courts still need to look at in terms of protections for religion that exist outside of the charter. And those were the issues that we brought to bear in our intervention.
So one of the things that's interesting to me, and that it's my perception, is that this is actually a fairly popular law in Quebec. Perhaps both of you can maybe comment on that. Now, of course, our rights are not contingent on being popular or unpopular. They're constitutionally protected, or they're not. But perhaps you could both comment on the public perception of the law in Quebec and outside of Quebec. Starting with you, Guillaume.
Yes, it's a very popular law. We see it in surveys. We see it last election. The CAQ government, which adopted that law, was re-elected with a landslide victory. So it's pretty clear that the law is popular. And if you look at the survey, a similar law would be less popular in other provinces. Would still would be maybe 50-50, but in Quebec it's much more, at least two-thirds or even more people support the bill. There are many reasons for that. Maybe the influence of France, where laws about laicity go even further. Also, the history of Quebec. With there used to be in Quebec just one big church. There was many churches, but one big church, the Catholic Church, which was very influential, and for some people it was just too much. So people that are old enough to remember the Quebec before the Quiet Revolution, they know that when religion is too influential in the public sphere, that becomes a problem. And then we also have immigrants from, example, from North Africa. They came here because they escaped radical Islam in their own country, and they fight for secularism as well.
Derek, what's your view on the popularity of the law? We've only got about 30 seconds.
Well, I think, as Professor Rousseau mentioned, there are a number of reasons people support the law in Quebec, and there are polls in other provinces that suggest others, at least a third of respondents in other provinces would support a similar law. But I think lost in that sometimes is the nuance of the impact this has on
Hmm.
minorities, and that's
Hmm.
precisely why human rights are protected in our
Hmm.
Constitution, is to reflect that minorities need protection
Right.
in cases where even laws
We've
have popular
we've
support.
we've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.